that we're now confronting. And Will's been a leader throughout his career, and certainly in his career as a council member in Montgomery County, on race, equity, and justice. And Will, you are speaking to us. It's the 6th speaker in a 6-part series on biblical justice, the pillars of biblical justice and racial equity. And when you spoke to us in April, St. John's had already begun this discussion about justice and what we're called to do as a faith community to advance justice in our community. And we got into that much more deeply after the COVID pandemic hit, and it exposed disparities that had always been there, but were greatly exacerbated and will continue even after the pandemic is over. And after the killings of George Floyd and others that provoked that enormous wave of popular protest for social justice. So there's many things that are going on in our environment now that weren't happening in April. And our community, our faith community, is looking for how we are going to actually do something in this environment to make a real difference. And we can't think of anyone better to help guide us on that path than you. And so I would like now just to turn it over to you. We hope today to discuss the pillar of biblical justice, what obstacles must be removed, what things must be changed so that everyone can achieve God's intention for the world, which is abundant life, shalom, through justice. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Ann, and to the entire, family. I know you all just finished church. St. John's Episcopal family. I just finished my service as well. So, really appreciate the opportunity to be back and to speak with you on such an important matter at such an important time in our history. As you laid out really well, I think we are dealing with multiple pandemics, and how we respond to this period, particularly as people of faith and as a broader society, I think will either bring us forward dramatically or has the opportunity to kind of stall us or maybe make some incremental steps, or there's some who seek to take us back the other way. So I think it's an open question of what will this moment yield as far as, more justice, more peace, more equality, more equity. The jury is out, and we're on the jury. Here we sit, having a role in determining that outcome. And so I just want to give big kudos to you all for understanding the moment we're in, and the commitment that you have and your church has, and the congregation and the leadership to making the most of it. So I really appreciate that. And again, I'm honored to be, I've seen the list of speakers. It's a very august group. So I'm honored to be in it, and really appreciate the opportunity to share some thoughts. It's something that I think about a lot. I don't think it's a coincidence that I have the opportunity to serve the residents of Montgomery County and of Maryland at this time in our history. I'm really thankful, despite all the challenges, to be in a position to try to improve our systems and our structures so that they achieve more justice and equity for more people. And that's always been a driver for me. But, there are times in history where you have the opportunity for, I think, exponential forward movement. And I think we are in one of those times. We're living through it. Some of you on this call, I won't presume the age, I think have lived through multiple times like that. I would say the period in the late 60s, was one of those times. You've also lived during times of regression. And so again, I think it's just important to realize that. So I do think, obviously there's so many quotes and things about justice. I want to tie in, kind of a macro concept and then give some local examples of which I think is always helpful of how we can really push the agenda forward here in Montgomery County and in the state of Maryland and in our region. Obviously, you all are very aware of the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. quote that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And also ancillary that's often quoted about, those who, I'm paraphrasing, but that stand by in the face of that injustice and do nothing are just as culpable. And so I've kind of always used that as a driver. I have another quote from Charles Hamilton Houston, who's someone, if you haven't read about him, he's a really interesting figure. He was the first Howard Law School dean. He was actually the mentor and teacher of Thurgood Marshall. And you hear about Thurgood Marshall as much, you don't hear as much as about Charles Hamilton Houston. But he has a quote that I keep above my desk at my office that says, a lawyer is either a social engineer or a parasite on society. And so I've tried to be the, the former in my career. So let me talk about the moment we're in and what I think we need to do. There is you think about the concept of abundance and scarcity. I wanted to talk about that a little bit. And it's a bit, obviously that's a biblical concept. It's faith-based, but it doesn't have to be. But I think that when we think about providing for our community, right? So often this concept of abundance and scarcity comes into play because it's our human nature to want to covet and hoard and keep for ourselves and provide for those who we know or who that we think are deserving, right? We inflate our own self-worth and our own virtues and minimize our vices. And I think that not only on an individual level, but aggregated, along with in kind of an ignorance of history, predisposes us, and you saw this exacerbated by the current occupant of the White House. Thank goodness he will not be the current occupant much longer, but I have to say that. I know that's my opinion. I'm sure it's shared by many, but that it plays into that idea that in order for you to be taken care of individually, others cannot be taken care of. It's a zero-sum game. If they get something, you're going to lose something, right? That idea of which is a scarcity idea, that there's not enough for us to all do well, right? And now, obviously, the real world reality of there are limited resources. I have to make decisions every day about how do we spend our resources, taxpayer dollars, to best and most efficiently support a high quality of life, safety, education, for our residents. So there are real world considerations, but how you approach that question, do you approach it from a position of abundance of what's possible, or do you approach it from a position of scarcity? And I think too often in how we seek to care for people, we are leaning heavily towards the scarcity model. And one of my hopes from this moment, and what I'm trying to do on the council, and I'm not saying I have all the answers and that everything's figured out, but I do know this, that there is an opportunity and an obligation, in my view, to ensure that everyone here in our community has the opportunity to succeed and live their God-given potential, and to have support in doing so. And I think if you said that as a general statement, most people would say, yeah, I agree with that. But when you get into the details of what that means and of actual decisions, it gets a lot more fuzzy. And what I think is a real challenge for us now in this moment, and this is in every arena, we have to fix the systems of inequity and injustice that our country was based upon, right? The economic system that brought us all of our wealth, chattel slavery, genocide of indigenous peoples before that. We have to reckon with the downstream consequences that we are living through right now of that system. And and I think that you can't do that unless you understand what happened, right? So that I think we talked about this last time a little bit, the history of what happened here, and how we have deriven our wealth and our prosperity from the subjugation, genocide, forced labor, torture, rape, mutilation, separation of children from their families. We have to reckon with that. And then legal systems and structures that reinforce that same ideology, and that I think, in many ways still do reinforce that ideology, whether you talk about mass incarceration, or how we fund our certain education systems and the like. We have to understand that that's what we're living in. So our work is to deconstruct that unjust system, again, for the goal of making sure that everyone has the opportunity to achieve their God-given potential. And the bonus to that is, it's not only the right thing to do, when we do it, it actually benefits all of us. I think JP Morgan Chase put out a study maybe last month where they calculated over the last 20 years how much institutional and systemic racism has cost the country in terms of dollars. And it was in the, I think it was in the, either trillion or hundreds of billions. I can't remember the exact number, but it was a big number. And that was only the last 20 years through lost opportunity, people that didn't get loans, that weren't able to start businesses, people have been incarcerated, et cetera. They had a whole metric. And I encourage you to read it, because it's an example of how we suffer as a society when we limit the ability of other people to achieve, earn, and to prosper, right? And it's lost potential. And so I think it's not only the right thing to do, but it's also right for all of us. And I think the scarcity mentality says that, no, that's not true. You have to get it and they have to not have it. And so what does that mean in real terms? I'll spend my last few minutes on some things I think we need to do here in Montgomery County, and I'm working on, and I think how we can move this debate forward. Because I will tell you, just be flat out with you, I think the way we operate as a county right now, in the predominant view, leans towards scarcity. It leans towards lack. It leans towards trickle-down economics, which has never been true, right? It leans towards, if you benefit the wealthy of us, among us, then things will come down and help the others. And that has never been true. And to the extent that it is true, it's marginal, incremental, right? If you get, a nice development that has the ability to have, in a 500 person building, you get to have 10 affordable units. That's not justice to me. That's not equity. So I think we have a challenge in our mindset here, and I'm not attributing it to any one individual. I just mean collectively. And I think we need to do some radical thinking. So what do I mean by that? I've talked a lot about the criminal justice system, and I will talk about that, and we need to reimagine and reform that. But let's talk about the economic system a little bit. We have right now a inequitable and unjust tax system in Montgomery County, in my view. No matter who you are, you pay 3.2% income tax here in Montgomery County. So whether you're Daniel Snyder, the owner of the Washington football team, who's making hundreds of millions of dollars, he pays 3.2%. And the single mother, who's working 40 hours a week or two jobs and making $40,000 a year, she pays 3.2%. That's not true on the state level. We actually do have tax brackets at the state level. So one of the things that I've argued for, and I'm thankful we actually were able to include just this week, I put in a letter of the council's priorities for state legislative action, is the ability for counties to levy and have different tax brackets. And I'll give you an example. If we were to raise the top marginal, create a bracket, there aren't any brackets, but if we were to be able to create a bracket locally and raise the top rate from 3.2% to 3.5%, so very small increase, just on millionaires in Montgomery County. And you have to remember, Maryland has the most millionaires per capita in the country. We are in the wealthiest county and the wealthiest state in the wealthiest country in the history of the world. That's where we sit right now today. And it's a great thing, but it also comes with great responsibility. If we were to raise that marginal rate from 3.2% to 3.5%, just on millionaires, people making over $1 million, that would raise over $90 million a year in additional revenue for Montgomery County, 90 million. And you could do a lot of things with that money, more affordable housing, more access for health services, rental assistance, education, after school programming, go down the list of things that we know would help. So I'm hoping to make progress. That's a very tangible thing. We also have our property tax system similarly, whether you have a 20,000 square foot home or a 1,100 square foot home, you pay the same property tax rate. I think we should make that progressive as well. So I'm arguing that we get that ability. On the local level, I'm working on an effort that I'm going to launch next year to provide a universal basic income pilot to residents here in Montgomery County. I don't have to tell you that the cost of living here is high. What you have to make to get by and make ends meet and to provide for basic needs like healthcare, housing, transportation, childcare is a big one. There's not much left. And for many families, that's a huge problem. So I think we need to relieve the pressure of some of those basic needs, things that I'm sure if I listed that list to you again, certainly healthcare, childcare, food, things that you would argue, all of us would argue, and our faith tradition teaches us, Jesus teaches us, are things that should be provided for everybody, right? Those are the things that are costing people the most and limiting their ability to move forward in their career, to take that education, that extra class, to make an investment in their child's education. There's too much pressure built in our system. Now, are we going to solve all of that in Montgomery County? No, but we can certainly be a model. I'll tell you, I've worked in the White House, I've worked at the Department of Education, I've worked on Capitol Hill. Often things are based on what happens at the local level. So I think we have an outsized role to play in being a model. And so certainly we need changes at the federal and state levels as well, but we have a role. Don't let anyone tell you we don't have a role in setting a model, because that's another argument. That's another scarcity model. Well, yes, it would be great to have progressive taxation and it'd be great to try these things, but it needs to be a federal answer. That's a cop-out in my view. We have the ability here to demonstrate forward movement and forward progress. And actually that puts pressure on the people above to do the same. And so I'm going to be rolling that out in the next several months, and an opportunity to prove, not only help those individual families that'll be a part of a pilot, but to show that when you do this, they're actually more productive. Again, back to this virtuous cycle of they make investments. They don't throw the money away. They use it on things that are needed. They go get that extra course. They get a job. They improve their income, right? And how we recover from COVID, which has been the most inequitable recovery that we've ever had. There was an article in the Washington Post, I'll try to share it before I get off, that talked about, of the people who lost their jobs between March, April, and May, the spring, in the height of this crisis, only 30% of African-American folks who lost their jobs have retained employment. About 50% for Latino, about 80% for white residents. So this has exacerbated the inequities that already, you remember the mortgage crisis, which literally wiped out Black wealth, the subprime mortgage crisis. Here we are again, 15 years later, and another devastating blow to communities of color and low-income residents. So if we to do the same things is out of the question for me. We can't do things the way we used to do them, because we've devastated communities for too long. And I don't have to tell you our demographics here. One of the great things about Montgomery County is that we have 4 of the top 10 most diverse cities in the country. Between Black, Latino, and Asian, we're 52% of the population. But that means we also have great economic and socioeconomic and racial ethnic diversity that we need to make sure that everyone's coming up at the same time. And we need to be intentional about that. I think we put some things in place with our racial equity bill, with our to give us some data to help us have the information we need to make those decisions. but the jury is out on how aggressively we will make them. I'll tell you, I am in the midst, last example I'll give you, Ann, and then I'll turn to questions. I am in the midst of we're going to vote on Monday, tomorrow, on a growth policy for the county. It's called the subdivision staging policy. And it lays out, we do it every 4 years, of what are the rates going to be for impact taxes for development, and where are we going to incentivize things, and what's going to happen, how much money is going to go to transportation and schools infrastructure to help with overcrowding and infrastructure on our roads. And I'm really struggling because this whole exercise has been a dramatic lowering of the impact taxes and fees that development pays in a dramatic way, which reduces by at least $11 million a year. It might be more once it's all said and done, the money that's going into our revenue streams for education and transportation. And the idea is, the proponents of this lowering are that, well, we have to lower everything because we need more housing and more things built, and that will help us, right? And if we lower it to a point, that will produce what we need. And I think, again, that has not happened anywhere where people want to live. We have no example of lowering fees and taxes enough to support equality and justice in housing and food for everyone that needs it. It just doesn't happen. There's no example of it. People pocket the profits. And I have been pushing throughout this process to try to have reasonable kind of controls, public benefit, affordable housing, not give away the whole store. Like a lot of these abatements are 100%, like giving away everything. I'm like, how about we just do an incentive and I've been, it's been difficult. I've gotten a couple things in there, but overall, this viewpoint is a challenge for us. And I think it's something that most people don't pay attention to, but we're not going to be able to do anything and provide justice other than in an incremental way for a small set of people, unless we fundamentally change how we approach growth, development, economic justice, and certainly, how we treat people fairly under the law in the point of our criminal justice system. So we have a lot to do. But the good news is I think we have an opportunity to do it here in Montgomery County, and to be a model and to espouse a vision of a place where you have a high income, you have a high quality of life, you have a diverse community where everyone can truly do better when we all do better. But we're going to have to do things differently. So that's the frame I wanted to give you today, and I'll pause and we can ask questions. I think that was part of it too. So let me pause there.
Well, thank you so much for giving us that very important context, and for also recalling the theological and biblical roots for that vision that you're holding out. I see in our audience here today that we have many people who, in recent weeks, we've been discussing all kinds of issues with respect to racial equity and social justice, from criminal justice reform to affordable housing to health disparities, the work that you've done with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the Memorial Project on Lynching and Learning Our History. And I know that they will raise those specific issues. So I would like to just ask you one question before we turn to those more specific things. And you mentioned we have a lot of work to do. You laid out a compelling vision for what needs to be done. My question to you is, what role is there for a faith community like this one that is really searching, that is really trying to find out how we can act in a way to really make a difference? And you mentioned you just come from your church. I guess that's AME Kingdom Fellowship, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And we have had some connection with them. We were inspired by all the great work you've been doing on food distribution to set up a food distribution in Bethesda, which we're doing. But I have to tell you, it was in consultation with AME Kingdom Fellowship. And I was wondering, what are they doing? How are you engaging as a faith community on these issues? Could you offer us just a few thoughts on the how of it? And then I'll leave it to my colleagues here from St. John's to go after the specifics of the specific issues. And thanks again for being here. Well, we really appreciate this.
No, thank you, Ann. And that's a great question. I'm so happy. I did hear that you had started a food distribution. I did not know that you had consulted with Reverend Kendra and Kingdom Fellowship. I'm glad to hear that. And that's been a great effort. I mean, they have set up, there's a lot of models. I'll just be specific. They have set up a community development corporation CDC, and that is a good model and they are now serving as the East County regional hub,
right?
Yeah, to provide other services that are needed, and that's there's 8 hubs around the county, and they're the ones in the eastern part of the county, and so I think the work, there's a lot of work to be done, right? And the laborers are few, right? As we always hear. But I think that, so there's a number of models you can set up. And I don't know, depending on your denomination and the rules, but you can set up a development corporation that can have a focus on certain areas that you see are location specific and needs that are there. Could food, housing, workforce development. There's a whole range of things. I also think that provides some ability to also, as having that nonprofit corporation that's separate from the church, that they can call for policy changes that are relevant, to that work. Certainly as individual members, you all can say whatever you want to your elected officials, but I think having a larger voice on some of the systemic and structural changes that need to happen, how we approach our tax policy, how we approach our housing policy, how we approach education.
Precisely.
Those are areas where your voices are needed so much, because I think the voices that tend to dominate tend to be the ones that want to keep things like they are, or move them more in their favor, and it's just and so I think picking a couple, having an entity or doing it through your church, focusing on a couple of key areas and really going, deep in those areas of how you want to have an impact. I think that's helpful. And then letting us know, us being folks in public policy, so that there can be a meaningful leveraging or public-private partnership, that has enabled Kingdom Fellowship to partner with the county and others to help do that work. And I think that's something that is always a good thing as well. And so I don't want to presuppose what issues you all want to focus on, but I think picking a few and going deep there, and then as you grow and expand, you could do more. I think that's a strategic way to do it, and those CDCs can help. But then don't forget that advocacy role, because I think the church, people of faith, the as an entity yourself, but also as individuals, you have a large voice to play in trying to push us to to really seek that justice that we're all looking for, to find it rather.
Well, that I was getting precisely at that latter point. We're working very hard on the humanitarian issues. We thank Kingdom Fellowship for inspiring us and guiding us on the food thing. But we just had set up this past fall new bodies in our church, a social justice advocacy committee, for example, a justice and outreach coordinating committee, to help us on precisely that advocacy with our government officials. We're speaking with you today, but we've had other council members. We go to Annapolis, we lobby at the state level. We're developing that role and that voice very strongly. And so we're certainly interested in going deeper into certain issues. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues to ask about those specific things. But we'd be very interested in working with you and Kingdom Fellowship,
Please.
for example, if we could partner on social justice advocacy specifically, where we could join voices. That would be a terrific thing in my view.
Well,
but let me just
count me in. We'll make those connections.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, let me now not dominate the conversation, because I know we'll have lots of great questions. Bill, would you help me manage the question process?
Absolutely. So we'll just encourage folks to raise your hand. We'll call your name, or you can type, if you'd rather type something in the chat. Councilmember Jawando, we have a kind of convention of going between hand raisers, and then I'll read something on the chat too as well.
Sounds good.
So I don't see anything in the chat at this point. Anybody? Mark, go ahead. You can take yourself off mute.
Oh, thanks very much, Bill. And Council Member, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate your message about changing from an attitude of scarcity to an attitude of abundance. I work here with the Social Justice Advocacy Group at St. John's, and we all would benefit from an end to systematic racism. And by the way, congratulations on the passage of the ban the box bill.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, it would help the job applicants with criminal records get through that first screen. I've got a related idea for you to think about. I also teach at Georgetown on the governance of emerging technology. And in that capacity, I testified before the New York City Council on a bill that would require vendors to conduct bias audits for their employment decision tools. It doesn't change the underlying discrimination law, but it does require audits that let employers know whether their employment software might have a discriminatory effect.
Oh, wow.
It seems to be the kind of step forward that would really help employment fairness and diversity in the workplace. I wonder if you would be interested in taking a look at it and consider it as something that might make sense for Montgomery County.
Yeah, no, definitely. Thank you, Mark. And thank you for bringing up the ban the box bill. We passed that, and now every employer, both part-time employment will be covered and full-time, anyone who employs more than one person, so yeah, really, really excited about that as one of the, as you said, one of the many things that we trying to remove the barriers. We've also pushed the time window. You can't ask about any criminal history or do a background check until after you've made a conditional offer. So you have to look at the person as they are and judge their process ability, and then you can look. And then if you want to make a decision, you can. But I think that's a great bill. Yeah, I would love to know more about that vendor training. When we were passing the racial equity bill, we talked about how do we, part of the bill requires training of all of our employees and staff, right? And starting with the managers, so that kind of a train the trainer model to understand the history and understand the importance of racial equity, and hopefully that filters through. But the question was raised and we didn't answer it, of how do you deal with vendors? We do $1 billion in procurement a year in Montgomery County. And, I passed a bill earlier in the year to get more of that to small local businesses. But we also need to make sure that folks are being equitable and we're minimizing bias in those things. So I'd love to look at a potential way to do that, and requiring training certainly is one of those ways. So yeah, would love to follow up with you directly on that.
Great, happy to do it. Thanks.
Yeah.
Annelise, I think I saw a hand up a little while ago. Did you have a comment or question?
Thank you. And thank you, Will, for being with us today. It's a very important issue. We have been, as Ann said, part of the Social Justice Action Committee has been partaking in joining these meetings about racial justice and certainly the reform of the criminal justice system, particularly in Maryland. There have been studies that show that 70% of all people in Maryland's prison, more than 70% of all people in Maryland's prison are Black. It is by far, the racial disparity is very surprising that it leads the country. And then we engaged in a bill that's going to be introduced in the Assembly in January. Representative Jazz Lewis, I think, is going to introduce a bill that would end extreme sentences for youth. In Maryland, you can be sentenced with life without parole as a child, basically, throwing away the key. And I guess we would like to hear your thoughts on, granted that is a state issue, but it has a big impact on where we are as a state and in the country in terms of, coming to dealing with racial justice and racial inequity in our justice system.
No, thank you. And it's, I knew I would get asked about this, so I didn't really focus on it in my remarks, but I want to, obviously, the first bill I introduced was related to criminal justice issues, the Law Enforcement Trust and Transparency Act, which is now law and requires an independent investigation and public reporting anytime a police officer kills a resident, which is obviously a horrible thing, where you need the most transparency and the most accountability. Now that law, I'm happy to say, we're not there yet, but it is being used as a base for statewide legislation to create a independent body that would investigate police involved death across the state. And when you shouldn't have the friend or the colleague of the person who killed somebody investigating them. It just doesn't, it's not a way to engender trust. So it's one of the many issues we got to work on. Obviously, we passed a landmark use of force bill over the summer that I authored along with several of my colleagues to ban chokeholds, to prohibit striking restrained individuals. It raised the standard of when you can use deadly force from when it's reasonable to when it's absolutely necessary after other alternatives and de-escalation is used. The chief of police is currently drafting that new use of force policy now, and because it has a 6-month time window. We also, required a duty to intervene. We banned no-knock warrants like the one that killed Breonna Taylor and drug cases, which is the vast majority of when they're used. And so we handled some of the most urgent things, but there's so much more to do. And I'm going to put in the chat here before I go. I wrote an op-ed in the summer in the Washington Post about how the steps I think we need to take from a high level and some specifics to reimagine public safety, because the whole system is broken, right? And not just other places, it's broken here in Montgomery County too. Again, I think the other problem we have, in addition to the scarcity and the scarcity mindset, is that we have a trouble holding two truths at the same time, that we're a great place, but that we have significant challenges and disparities. And both of those things can be true and are true. Just like we are flawed individuals, the society is the same way. And the criminal justice system is at top of that list. If you look at, our statistics, they're pretty bad. And I'm actually going to be, in a couple of weeks, shedding even more light on some things that I think, again, people don't know. I commissioned the Office of Legislative Oversight to do a study on our police data. What's available, what's not available, what do we track, what don't we track, but also what are some of the disparities? And it underscored some really troubling facts. You mentioned the statewide number of incarcerated individuals. 50% of the people we arrest in Montgomery County are Black. And that's in a county where Black residents make up 18% of the population. 55% of the juveniles who we arrest and are Black. So it's a similar statistic for the juvenile system. You're 3 times more likely to be pulled over as an African-American resident, 7 or 8 times more likely than a white resident in Bethesda to be pulled over as a Black resident. So we have significant challenges. And then the latest thing I'm looking at, to your point of low-level offenses, is the amount of arrests that we have for low-level offenses, things like drug possession of low-level drug possession, things like disorderly conduct, and other things that are not violent crimes. A significant portion of our arrests are in those areas. And I don't have to tell you that they also disproportionately are of Black and brown residents. And so we have some serious challenges in how we approach public safety. We focused on arrests and stats and where we think crime is, and we'd use a broken windows type of style of policing. And for those who don't know what broken windows, it's a debunked theory and related to stop and frisk, where if you see a minor quality of life offense, you pull that string and you go check that out. And that's going to lead you to the bigger crime, and that's going to reduce crime. It's totally debunked, but we call it proactive policing here in Montgomery County. That's what our chief says. That's what they call it, proactive policing, where they stop people, they think they look out of place, and it could lead to anything from eroding the trust of that resident. Like when you stop someone and search their car for an hour and nothing happens, and then they go away and they feel horrible about their community, which is bad enough, all the way to someone being shot and killed. And in the case with Robert White, who was pursued because he had a ripped jacket, right? And ended up dying at the hands of a police officer, unarmed. And so, and everything in between. We have these things called trespass orders that we issue. We don't track the race and ethnicity. I had to go through a big thing with the police department to get them to compile all the trespass orders, which is an order that says, if you come back to this place in the next year, you will be arrested and charged with criminal trespassing. If you remember the incident in White Oak where the officer, the thing that got the most attention was that an officer called 3 Black young men the N-word. If you remember that, it became news last summer. And that she still hasn't been adjudicated, by the way. Another problem with our system. She's still on administrative leave, still working for the department. But also in that situation, they were also issued trespass orders that they couldn't come back to that White Oak McDonald's for the next year. We're not charged with any crime, but we're told they couldn't come back there. And when I asked, well, how many of those are being issued and who are they being issued to and where, I found out that they were being written down in paper copy at each individual station, and the form doesn't even ask race and ethnicity. This is one of the things that was uncovered in the OLO report. We don't track stop and frisks. We don't track what they call not to interrogations, but kind of stopping people and asking what they're doing. So there's this whole set of things we don't even track, and the things we do track, we know are happening disproportionately. So we've got some serious issues here. I have proposed some solutions. We'll continue to propose solutions around training, around changing what we focus on, and how we right size our police department. On Tuesday, I'm introducing a bill with Councilmember Raisner to remove police officers from our schools. We also know that 50% of the students arrested over the last 4 years have been Black students, even though they only represent 20% of the population. And when you look again at the deeper level of what they're being arrested for, it's things like fights and low-level drug possession and things that people shouldn't be being arrested for in the first place. In my view, they should be either getting social service support or being handled administratively within the school. And so that's an example of how we need to change the form and function of our police department and what we focus on to eliminate the opportunity for bias and for discrimination, which is a huge, huge problem. So I gave you a lot there, but I'm going to put the op-ed in there. And I think I'd love for you all to support the SRO bill, because right now that's $3 million we spend for those officers that I'm on the same day, I'm going to be proposing that we spend that money on restorative justice training for staff and for mental health therapists and for counselors in our schools. That's where we need to be spending that money, in research-based approaches that are shown to reduce discipline issues and to support the whole student. And so I think that is an early debate and an early opportunity for us to start shifting and reallocating dollars. We also need to do it in mental health. And we did take steps to allocate money for 6 more crisis intervention counselors. And we're exploring models for where you can deploy crisis intervention, nurses, crisis intervention counselors instead of police or alongside police, depending on the situation. We're looking at the CAHOOTS model in Eugene, Oregon. We had a good call with them a few weeks ago. So I think we're making some progress, but there's significant pushback and will be significant pushback. We're also looking into automated traffic enforcement and other things to, again, minimize and right-size the role of police. We want them focused on violent crime. We want them focused on not this proactive policing and not low-level offenses, which disproportionately leads to those numbers like that 70% at the state level, the 50 and 55% here at the local level that are a problem.
So Councilmember Jawando, I'm going to try to draw from the chat. There's a fair amount of chatter going on.
And I will be much shorter with my response. I know that was a long response. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, you're a popular guy today. So let me just, I'm going to ask a kind of a broad question, but we'll draw on taking the universal basic income or progressive tax reform as an example. Anne spoke to how many folks in the church are starting to become more active in terms of advocacy, but maybe for those of us who aren't quite as civically astute, can you comment on what would you, given a lot of positive support for the sentiments you expressed, what do you wish you would hear from us on, or how do you wish, like if you had your wish in terms of St. John's engagement, what would you like to hear? What would you like to hear from us, and how would you like us to be engaged? Can you share any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, there are a number of ways, obviously kind of advocacy 101, you can write us emails, you can call in to our offices. You can write letters. There are coalitions, like other faith-based coalitions, obviously Jews United for Justice, and there are the AIM network. I don't know if St. John's is a member of AIM or not. No, but that's fine. You don't have to be. I mean, there are ways to join in with other coalitions to send individual and collective letters and correspondence. I think that's one way. And in order to do that, you kind of have to know what's going on. So I don't know. I know Ann does a good job of, and if you have a formal mechanism to track kind of what we're working on, and if we can have a point of contact, which I think we do in Ann, of when we need to send out an action alert of, we're introducing this bill on Tuesday related to removing SROs from schools and investing in these other supports for students, for example. That's an issue where we'd like to hear from, your voices. When we work on the progressive tax approaches, again, this is something I proposed last year. It was voted down, the council 6-3 to support that effort, right? You probably didn't know that. We need to make sure you all know that so that you can reach out to the people who voted against it and tell them why it's important. And so I think there's that kind of arms and legs of, one, knowing the information, and that's a two-way street. I want to make sure I'm communicating to you what we're working on. I want to hear back from you, priorities and thoughts you have, and then we can, based on the calendar, kind of structure your advocacy around, the local and the state calendar. I think that would be helpful. And obviously, if you do it in coalition, sometimes we'll have press conferences. A lot of times we're doing one on Tuesday, it'll be by Zoom, for safety. But I think having you all participate in giving testimony, right? Coming before, I think, Ann, you've done that before, and others, signing up to testify at our public hearings in support of these various pieces of legislation, or, so those are kind of the mechanisms, that I think would be helpful around specific issues. And then we can work with you to kind of highlight when it might be most appropriate. But I don't know, and I'm assuming I keep saying Ann, I'm assuming it's Ann, but I'm sure there's others, and maybe it's on different issues where you have kind of point people that are focused on and tracking those issues so that you can notify the group, and then you can be nimble enough to respond in a timely fashion. Because a lot happens and it happens quickly. I think those would be some strategies.
Thank you.
We are trying to do that, Will. We're trying to have individuals who are following specific issues know what's happening at the level of the council or state, and then we can get engaged. So thank you for those very concrete suggestions.
Okay, Bill Kennedy, I think you've had your hand up a few times. Go ahead and take yourself off mute. I think you're still on mute.
Yeah.
There you
All
go.
right. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right. Well, we live in one of the most progressive counties probably in the country. We're heavily Democratic. We're very liberal. Why can't we get some of these things done? I mean, a simple example of 3.2% to 3.5%, a simple example of impact fees, yet it doesn't get done.
It's a great question, and I want to point out that we have at least three Williams on here between you and Bill, and so it's a good name. So I think a couple things. One, the idea that I talked about, that we have, I think the problem of Montgomery County, despite our progressive leanings and that we have a 9-member Democratic council and Democratic executive, is that this concept of we are a great place, but we have work to do. It's hard for people sometimes. I think that's, there's been a tendency to sweep things under the rug. I think we've taken some steps with our racial equity work to uncover some of the disparities, and that's a good step, because you can't fix a problem if you don't diagnose it. It's one of the reasons I introduced this racism as a public health crisis, to outline the ways that racism contributes to death and lower quality of life for many people. So knowing that you have the issues is step one, and I think we're getting there. I think we've made progress on that. The other issue is then, okay, what do you do about it? And what's the theory of what you do about it? And how you approach you know, I hate to say it, but, you know, there are things that are said by some you know, folks in my that I work with, that if you lined it up with like something Mitch McConnell said, it would be like the same statement, right? There are, you know, in our economic approach to this, well, you have to give away. There's this theory like we don't have housing, right? So you take something like we need more housing for people. Yes, I agree. We need more affordable housing for people. Yes, I agree. And then you take a quantum leap to saying, well, let's subsidize. Let's give a 15-year, 100% tax abatement to subsidize the most expensive type of housing that can be created on top of metros, and have no affordability requirements, and ask for no financial, you know, not have any really clue other than the developer's word of like how much profit they're making on said project from investors, and have it be built by people who aren't going to get a prevailing wage, which is another amendment I introduced that failed. So you have people building it that won't be able to afford to live in it, and creating the most expensive type of housing, and where the taxpayer is going to be subsidizing that to a great degree. And I'm all for transit-oriented development, and I think we want people living near transit. But it's a in my view, it's a warped view on economic policy. And it buys into this, like, you know, if you give everything away, the good things will happen. And the truth is that's not true. It will happen for some people, but it won't happen for it won't happen in a just and equitable way. And so I think we have to attack that argument. And that is the pervasive argument, not just in our county government. I think in a lot of places that is what we must do. We have in this whole Northern Virginia, Montgomery County thing, this is another huge problem. And it's not necessarily fact-based, where, well, Northern Virginia is kicking our butt and they have more businesses and they're doing better. And when you dig into that, it's not as true as you would think. We are different economies, we're different places. And I've tried to argue, let's focus on our assets. Let's focus on who we are as Montgomery County, and let's grow our small businesses, the 90% that make up the business community in our county that are less than 50 people. Let's help them grow. Let's help them get rent space and lease space that's affordable so they can grow their business. Let's you know, and I think it's just it's a macroeconomic approach that is very conservative and Republican, even though we're Democratic. I'm just going to be honest with you. I just think that's a huge impediment. And if you do it that way, you will only help on the margins. You will only help on the margins. And that's what we're doing right now. We're a margins policy. And I'm trying to change it, and I need your help with that. But I think that is the biggest. We might do a couple hundred units here. We do a couple of projects there, and we pat ourselves on the back that we're progressive and we did a great job. But we're not really changing the system. And I think that's the problem.
Okay, I think we'll draw one more from the chat. I'm just trying to pick which one to work on. Let's take one from Jay. This is a little different. So the comment is, as you know, Dr. King remarked that Sunday morning is the most segregated time in America. Do you think that's a problem? And if so, do you have any suggestions as to how we as a faith community could address that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it is. You know, I'm glad to spend part of my, you know, I'm fortunate. I get to go to a lot of faith communities, you know, and in Montgomery County, we're blessed with, you know, thousands of houses of worship. So Friday night, I can be with my Jewish brothers and sisters. I mean, or Saturday, I can be with my Jewish brothers and sisters. Friday night, I can be with the Muslim community. And then on Sunday, you know, you can make the Christian circuit. And I see that segregation. There are communities here that we do have a lot of faith institutions that are more diverse here. I think that's a good thing. I think some of the things that Ann was just talking about earlier about partnering with other institutions that are like-minded on issues of social justice is a great way to start to do that. And I know you all are interested in that and want to do more. You know, but then I think obviously being welcoming and opening to others. You know, I think there's probably some things that could be done as having some joint services from time to time, some ecumenical services. I'm sure you all do that. I've seen that as an effective model. But our faith traditions are based on our land use and segregation patterns and land use too. I mean, I think traditionally where people live and how that's developed over time, which is another reason we need to promote a more equitable form of land use to make it so that people can afford to live in multiple places throughout the county. But yeah, I think partnering on social justice things, it is a problem. If we're not talking to each other, that's a problem.
Right.
And certainly if we're not talking to each other and worshiping with each other at the time where we're hopefully at our best selves, thinking about the global community and as we worship God, that's an issue. But I think as long as we're intentional about trying to break down those barriers, and I think we talked about a couple examples and ways to do it, and so I'm happy to help you all with that. I think issue-based advocacy and connection, ecumenical services during high holy, and then coming together when we have great tragedy. We've done a good job at that, I think, in the county. When one community has suffered, for example, the Jewish community, when we had that violence, we do well as our faith council and having ecumenical services. But I think you're right. During the normal times, quote unquote, we need to do better of kind of working together.
Well, thank you. I do think we're at time, so
I can give you 5 more minutes if you want.
Oh,
Absolutely.
thank you.
I was 5 minutes late, so I can do 5 more minutes.
Thank you for that. So Anne, is there any other comments or questions you have, or I can pull another one from the chat?
No, please, let's pull it from the chat. I saw several good ones there, so you choose.
Okay, I'm going to take one. This is a bit controversial, and I'm assuming you have some familiarity with this, Councilmember Jawando. So the Moses Cemetery, we've had some discussion and trying to, I guess I would say, discernment about that issue. And so the question is, what is keeping Montgomery County from simply halting further development of the site until forensic experts can weigh in? Are you familiar with the issue, Councilmember, and any thoughts on that?
I am, yeah. It's I'll say this, I've been trying to figure it out for 2.5+ years, just to give you an example of how convoluted it is. I'm certainly sensitive all throughout the country, and in Montgomery County is no different. We have had the kind of systematic desecration and disregard for burial sites of all kinds, particularly African-American. And here in the county, we're actually dealing with 2 separate issues, 2 related Moses Cemetery issues. There's one in Potomac, right near the 495, where there are literally bodies like buried, confirmed 100%. I've seen them. I was there a couple weeks ago, right by where they're trying to widen the Beltway, right? So there's a huge issue there. That one's a little more clear cut, and we can't let that happen, and it's part of an overall effort. The other one, I think no one's disputing that there wasn't a cemetery in that area at one point. It's gotten really convoluted with some of the advocates and some of the tactics they've used and some of the language and approaches they've used that have really gotten, it's been unfortunately gotten ugly. I've met several of the archaeologists that are looking at that. One of them is an African-American woman who works for the developer who's trying to redevelop that property that they own. And do so in a respectful way. My focus has been, I'll say this, we need to memorialize and recognize and remember what happened in both sites, and then protect the desecration of the burials of the graves that we know are there in the context of the other cemetery. But I've been focused on that, and I think a position that you could take, you all do what you want, would be that there should be meaningful memorialization and recognition and preservation of where there are active, graves, and that's kind of what I've taken. People will argue about what it means and where that is, but I think that's kind of the approach I've taken, and it had, unfortunately, it has gotten really convoluted, particularly on the Bethesda side.
Thank you so much, Will. Bill, I think maybe we
Do one more. Yeah, do
One more? Okay,
There you
one
go.
more. There was an earlier question about educational inequities and what specifically we can do to
Yeah,
address
that's great.
educational inequities.
Yeah, I think that I saw that one. I'm glad. Yeah, that's a good one to end on. You know, this is big for me. I spent a lot of my career as a civil rights lawyer working at the U.S. Department of Education. I worked at the NAACP legal department, and I was on the Senate Education Committee as a counsel to Sherrod Brown and Barack Obama in the Senate. I focused on that because I knew early on the opportunities I received in my educational career are a big part of my ability to be talking to you today as a council member. Not the only thing, but a big part. Um, uh, and I mean education in the broadest sense. And one of the things that I want to push, and I think this is a very specific thing that you all could help with, in addition to reallocating the dollars from policing to services that support our students, which is, you know, that's an important part. But we need to expand our community schools models. We have wellness centers, they're called in the high schools, and they're called linkages to learning centers in the middle schools and elementary. And these are where you have like a health clinic, you have wraparound services training for the parents, you have food being provided. So really it serves the school as kind of a community centered model where it's open throughout the day. Obviously, we're going to get back to school eventually, but even right now, these services are being provided virtually and socially distanced. For our students and families that are the most impacted, that are our lowest income, that have the most other challenges that they bring with them into the school building, we need to recognize that and provide those kind of wraparound service supports for those communities. I grew up in the Long Branch community of Silver Spring, which is still one of the lowest income communities. It's a Quebec Terrace area, University in Piney Branch, and it's heavily immigrant, and it really bothers me that, you know, 25 years can pass and it's still the same way, right? As far as the services that are being provided. And I just think we have to, if we're really going to address educational inequity, there's other things we need to do as far as teacher training and reducing bias, and there's a whole range of things. But if I could do one thing tomorrow, and I'm going to try to make this argument, and might be something we could work on together, it would be to fund those types of wraparound service programs at all the schools where we know that we need it, right? Right now, it's just not there. If you ask the superintendent, and it's primarily a budgetary constraint, right? But if we know that this works and that this helps kids and families and that it's needed, we need to get what it costs and make the argument that as a community, we should provide it. And so that is something that I'm going to try to crystallize in a clear way in the next year as a member of the education committee of here's where we know we need it. You know, because every year we get in this thing, we try to expand it to one school, or we do this and we do this incremental, and we're never going to get there that way. You know, we might need to expand over time, but let's have a full picture of the plan and be honest with the taxpayer and residents about here's why we want to do this, here's what it costs, and we need to do it as a community because it has benefits for these families and these students. And again, going back to our other argument, it has benefits for the broader community down the line. And so that is one thing that we know where the problems are. We know where we need after school programs. We know where we need these school-based health clinics. We know where parents need training in English, and we know all these things, but we have not had the political or collective will, in my view, to address them in an urgent way, which is what we need to do. So that would be one key lever.
Well, thank you so much again for all the wisdom you shared with us today. We know how busy you are, and we are so grateful that we've had the opportunity twice at pivotal moments in our internal discussion about how we can make a difference to have you offer us such great context and very specific actionable suggestions. And I just want to say it's an invaluable relationship, and we hope we can continue to be in touch with you and work with you together.
I appreciate the invite. I put my email in the chat. Please, I know we didn't answer everything, but if anyone wants to email me, and please support me, pray for me. Can I ask that? Because I'm often in the position of, I feel, pushing a rock uphill. You know, send me a note from time to time, you know, when, you know, pray for me. And then, you know, this isn't a political meeting, but, you know, there's other things you can do to support me. You know, I appreciate all of that, because it's nice to have support when you're trying to do the work. And this helps me feel supported today as well. So thank you very much.
Well, there's an opportunity, as you said at the beginning, so we'll keep our eyes fixed on that.
All right.
Thank you again so much.
Thank you.
God
Take care.
bless.
Everybody.
Thank you.
God bless you.
Thank you.
Thanks, organizers.
Thanks,
Bill?
everybody, for
Pleasure.
great questions.
I haven't been reading the chat. Can we get that saved and maybe sent to people?
Yes, absolutely. I have it saved, so we'll figure out how to distribute that.
Thanks.
Yes. Have a great week, everybody.
You too.
Bye.